Fresh meat.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. On today's episode of Playing with Fear. Welcome to JoBlo Horror Videos Playing with Fear, where we take a look at some of the landmark horror titles throughout the history of gaming. Today we travel to one of the most famous towns in horror video game history and peer through the fog to unpack what it has to say about grief, guilt, and other very real-world problems seen through the veil of a survival horror video game. Silent Hill 2 was released 20 years ago and is still one of the most revered and talked about horror games today. We've discussed survival horror quite a bit, I know, but it has horror right there in the title, so it's going to get tossed around on this show. On top of that, the genre has put in work moving horror in gaming forward even before it had a genre title. Alone in the Dark is where it started, Resident Evil gave it its biggest stage, but I'd say Silent Hill perfected it. Silent Hill is one of the few Resident Evil clones that was able to really have legs and move forward in interesting ways. Silent Hill began development in 1996 by Team Silent, who were outcasts from different departments within Konami. As they were already outcasts, they decided to make a game they thought was powerful and thoughtful and could speak to gamers on a deeper level than just shoot the monsters and escape. The game's director, Kiichiro Toyama, created the overall feel of the game and was inspired by the occult, David Lynch, and UFOs. The rest of the team took on parts of many religions to be included into the story while also keeping it vague at times. Really, if you don't search around enough, you get the bad ending and not have much of an explanation, and even contradictory at times to throw off the sense of realism. When it launched on February 23, 1999, it received mostly positive reviews while also eventually crossing the coveted 2 million sales mark that would not only net it a Green Label Greatest Hits re-release for the PlayStation 1, but also ensure that it would be diagnosed with sequelitis. Work began on a sequel in 1999 immediately after the release of the first game, again by Team Silent. The story scenario this time around was based on Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment from 1886. As a 16-year-old, I wasn't exactly burning through Dostoevsky's work, so I didn't really know, and honestly didn't find out until recently. The story would follow completely different characters this time around, and would start a trend that the town itself was the most important character, and that every future story would be told there. Sometimes previous games' characters would make an appearance or show up in a note, but other times it would be completely new. With a new generation of systems to design for, Team Silent was able to really push boundaries with graphics, setting, creature design, sound effects, and score. The game was released on PlayStation 2 on September 24, 2001, and later for the Xbox on December 21st of that year, with a short prequel scenario starring Maria added on. The game received incredible reviews and sold 1 million copies within its first month. It is often discussed on lists of both the greatest and scariest games of all time. I'd like to thank you guys for watching Playing with Fear, and ask that if you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now. Like this video and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video goes up. And now, back to the show. Silent Hill 2 opens with the protagonist, and I use the term loosely, but more on that later, James Sunderland, in one of the dirtiest rest stops I have ever seen. A female voice reads a letter out loud asking James to meet her in their special place in that town. James is confused as his wife, Mary, died 3 years ago, so he needs to find out what all this means. He sets out towards the town to investigate Rosewater Park, which was always one of their favorite landmarks. The outskirts of town are foggy beyond comprehension, and he ends up meeting Angela in the cemetery. She warns him that there's something wrong with the town, but he needs to find Mary, and she too is searching for her mother, so she understands. James works his way to the town and finds streaks of blood that eventually lead to the static of a handheld radio and a bizarre creature. He learns that static alerts him to the creature's whereabouts, but also hears what sounds like Mary. He kills the creature with a nearby tool and continues his quest. Even with a map, the town's layout is confusing and different. He finds another map with personal markings on it, pointing him to the apartment complex. There, he finds more of the creatures and runs into a small child that kicks away a key he needs. On the other side of some security bars, standing silent and imposing, is some sort of creature with what looks like a cast iron pyramid on its head. The radio is going crazy, but there's no immediate threat. After some bizarre puzzles that open up other parts of the apartment, James stumbles into a horrific sight of the pyramid head creature assaulting a pair of mannequins before setting onto him. He fires from a conveniently placed pistol and the creature wanders away. Gaining access to the adjoining building, James finds Eddie vomiting in the bathroom after claiming to have nothing to do with the dead body in the apartment's kitchen. Eddie, like Angela and James, was brought to this town searching for something. James eventually runs into Angela, who is markedly different in tone and attitude this time around, even appearing to be suicidal. James becomes standoffish when she says they all deserve the worst, and even scares her off when he admits to looking for his dead wife. James takes the bloody knife from Angela for her own safety. Finally unlocking the route to the park, James must go through Pyramid Head after walking in on assaulting yet another creature. He fills it with bullets again before it walks down the stairs, the water blocking the way draining behind it. James confronts the child he saw in the apartment and is stunned when she mentions Mary's name before running off. He makes it to Rosewater Park and sees the silhouette of who he believes to be Mary before realizing it isn't, that Maria could be her twin sister, albeit the slightly spicier version. Bewildered, James takes Maria with him as she is frightened, and the two head towards the Lakeview Hotel, which was the couple's other special place. They cut through the local bowling alley where they run into Eddie and the little girl, who we come to learn is named Laura. Laura obviously knows something about Mary, so they chase her to a Brookhaven hospital. The hospital is the same as the apartment building, with obtuse puzzles locking them out of certain rooms and horrible monsters to fight. Appropriately here, it is twisted nurses mostly. They get to a patient's room and suddenly Maria falls ill. James tells her he's off to find Laura. On the roof, James finds a seemingly familiar diary and is knocked over the side by Pyramid Head. He wakens in another part of the hospital and works his way to finding Laura, who is playing in an abandoned ward. The two discuss Mary. Laura was her friend at the hospital the previous year, even though Mary passed 3 years ago, furthering James's confusion and anger. Laura leads James to what she says is a letter from Mary before locking him in a room where he must fight a handful of living body bags. James exits the room to a twisted version of the hospital and seeks Maria. She has fled the room and James ends up finding her frightened and alone. She chastises him for leaving her and the two set off to find Laura again before getting stuck in a surreal game show in an elevator. The two find the way out but are chased down a hall by Pyramid Head and Maria is killed while James escapes into an elevator. After journeying to the Silent Hill Historical Society, James follows an absurdly long tunnel that leads him underground where he jumps into a hole, then another, until he finds Eddie with a gun and yet another dead body. Eddie admits to killing him and a dog, and maybe more. Now finding himself in a prison, James learns much about the town's sordid past and its inhabitants before finding yet another hole, and another shortly after. A third straight hole, and an elevator that seems to go on forever leads James to an unfathomable underground structure stalked by many creatures, including Pyramid Head. He finds Maria behind bars where she has suddenly become something else, something sinister. She asks him about the tape they made at the hotel before coming onto him hard. James works his way around to her and ends up rescuing Angela from a Cronenbergian bed monstrosity before she finishes it off Scream 1 style with a TV to what is most likely its head. James gets a view behind the curtain of the abuse Angela suffered, and she kicks him out, seeing the same tendencies her father showed and accusing him of getting rid of his wife. When James finally gets to Maria, she lies there dead from the stab wound he watched her take at the hospital, and the body even showing signs of decomposing. James jumps into one final hole and confronts Eddie, who has murdered a room full of people and completely gone off the rails. James reluctantly kills Eddie in self-defense and is shattered that he killed a real person instead of one of these twisted monsters. Somehow, impossibly, James ends up at the docks and rows his way toward the hotel. He finds Laura in the ballroom and they discuss Mary and their relationship. Laura hands him a soul-crushing letter and James now fully believes Mary is alive at the hotel. After more puzzle solving and avoiding death, James finds the tape and watches it in the room he shared with his wife. Mary got sick and James couldn't take it. He killed her himself by suffocating her in the hospital bed. He finally admits this to himself and Laura, who finds him and verbally and physically attacks him. A final radio call pleads with James to come to her, and with nothing left to lose, he obliges. The lower portion of the hotel is now flooded and ruined, and James opens a door to find an absolutely off-the-rails Angela, who is calling him Mama. She regrets him saving her as she feels she deserved to die, and further existence is nothing but pain and confusion, before asking for the knife back and heading up a staircase engulfed in flames that she says is always there for her. James enters a room to find not only one, but two Pyramid Head creatures that kill Maria, and James understands what it all means. He beats the demons both literal and figuratively before they impale themselves in place, standing as statuesque reminders of his deeds. James heads down a final hallway, replaying the final conversation with Mary before opening the door to his final task. The grief demon known as Maria tries to dress as Mary, but he rejects her before killing the manifestation once and for all. James speaks with the good memories of Mary and admits to both her and himself that her death wasn't just for her. She forgives him so he may forgive himself, and he can finally move past the grief and guilt that has haunted him for 3 years. The game ends with the missing letter from Mary to James and him walking confidently away from the town, away from his pain. Gameplay in Silent Hill 2 is pretty typical. It has tank controls as you navigate the environments, an inventory system to manage, though not one limited by space this time, and a save system scattered throughout the foggy landscape. Combat is wonky, but makes sense in the context of the game. James is about as everyman as you can get, and doesn't carry with him the killer skills of a military or special ops guy. Aiming isn't concise, and even when you use melee weapons, you can whiff as much as you connect. Items include the weapons and their ammo if they need any, healing items, and key items. The key items can be anything from, keys, to any piece of a puzzle you need to figure out. Other non-items encountered in the world of Silent Hill are the various notes left about the place. These are mandatory as the puzzles are one of the most dynamic parts of the game. Riddle difficulty is an option, and when you set it to higher difficulties, you will need to take some serious notes and make sure you find all the files. The enemy roster is small but impactful. The mannequin, the nurse, and the lying figure make up your moment-to-moment battles, with bosses outnumbering the regular creatures with the Fresh Lip, Abstract Daddy, Eddie, Mary, and of course Pyramid Head. The Abstract Daddy even appears as a regular obstacle in the final areas. Unlike most survival horror, ammo conservation isn't really a concern here as there is plenty of it. There are tons of optional areas and encounters that mostly amount to storytelling, but are well worth seeking out. James is the only playable character here, unless you're playing the Xbox or later PS2 editions that include the Maria bonus chapter. It's a nice addition to the mythos, but certainly isn't necessary. What is necessary is playing the game multiple times in order to see the 6 endings. These range from the suicide, to redemption, to repeating a cycle, the infamous dog ending, and the series-spanning UFO ending. There is no canonical ending according to the creators, as the player must choose what to believe really happened. All these entries require specific things, with 3 of them needing to be on the second playthrough, and one of them is incredibly dark on how you achieve it. I don't have to ask our usual question of whether the game is scary or not. It was scary when I was a 16-year-old when it came out, and it's deeply disturbing now. Most of the voice acting adds a little bit of cheese to the whole affair, but a lot of it, particularly Mary reading her own letter before the credits, are top-notch and create a visceral feeling. There's just too much to mention here, but the entire game, from the fog-drenched town, to the creature design, to the messed up story, to the audio design that ties everything together, will keep you thinking about and coming back to that sleepy little town year after year. The themes that Silent Hill 2 presents, grief, loss, guilt, anger, shame, are far scarier than anything you'll find in most survival horror games. The designers just happen to wrap these feelings into a grotesque manifestations that you fight. Everything happening internally and behind the scenes is far more frightening than what is in plain sight. I'm certainly not alone in thinking Silent Hill 2 is one of the greatest games, horror or otherwise, in the history of gaming. Its influences were felt by games both in and out of its own series. Pyramid has become almost the mascot for the series, and appeared in other games as well as the movies. The series would have 2 more games that felt like Silent Hill, with the excellent Silent Hill 3 that tied back to the first game, and the flawed but fun Silent Hill 4 that took a chance on a lot of different aspects, but ended up with a mixed bag. We would get comic books, movies, toys, and all manner of merchandise to follow, cementing the series in the gaming and pop culture landscape. Team Silent would disband, and other companies would take the reins, which would give us action-y titles, remakes, prequels, a handheld exclusive, and a disappointing failed attempt to make the series scary again. In 2012, we would get a remaster collection containing Silent Hill 2 and 3 for the Xbox 360 and PS3. Konami hoped this would be a celebration, but due to the game needing to be partially remade with the original code being lost, the titles would end up as a buggy mess. Buggy mess that wouldn't even see fixes on the Xbox 360. PT would seem to spell the end for Silent Hill after what is certainly one of the biggest debacles in gaming, but hopefully the parent company decides to do more with the series than pachinko machines. What's your favorite moment from Silent Hill 2? What's your favorite game in the series? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our JoBlo Horror Videos channel. Tell your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all your support.